Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon. So everybody has joined now.
Ma'am, the participants are yet to come.
Okay. I think we should start. When they come, they will join. We have already started the text of Jameson's The Cultural Logic of Postmodernism, late capital. So we have started the first paragraph. And the gist of that paragraph was that there is a change now. This is what Jameson has noticed in the last few years. What is the change? That there is a loss, there is a sense of loss, the loss of this thing or the loss of that thing. This he terms as postmodernist situation. And then he moves on to describe a number of postmodernist artists, painters, writers, etc. In the second paragraph, that is page number 54, we have to start with the rise of aesthetic populism. Now, what is populism? Populism has a political connotation. In fact, it is the policy of appeasement. This is something we are very much familiar with these days also, that our political leaders, they try to appease different groups, different communities to with a view to gather more and more votes. But in this case, it is aesthetic populism. Aesthetic means related to beauty in art, literature, architecture, and other fine arts, other modes of fine arts. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. In the very beginning, when we started discussing about postmodernism in general, and then we took up the gist of this essay, in that also I focused on the mixing of high and low culture. This is, in fact, aesthetic populism. And what is the aim? The aim is to promote the interests of the culture industry, or in other words, we can say the interests of capitalism. The main focus is in every way, that is culture, industry, or capitalism. So we have to start now. I shall take up those parts which are important, and no doubt the whole of this essay is important, but it cannot be discussed in detail. So only those sections which are relevantly important, I shall focus on those sections only. So in the very beginning, he says that that is also we have made clear in our first two classes, that it is in the realm of architecture, however, that this modification in aesthetic productions are most dramatically visible, and that their rhetorical problems have been theoretical problems have been most centrally raised and articulated. It was indeed from architectural debates that my own conception of postmodernism, as it will be outlined in the following pages, initially began to emerge. So initially, it was from architecture that Jameson has started this discussion on postmodernism. More decisively than in any other arts or media, postmodernist positions in architecture have been inseparable from an implacable critique of architectural high modernism. High modernism is the term that also we have discussed when we were discussing about postmodernism in general. I told you earlier also that high modernism refers to a group of authors like T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, etc. They were known as high priests of high modernism. So here also in architecture, there was a phase that was known as high modernist phase. So high modernism and of the so-called international style. The names are given within bracket of those high modernist architects. Frank Lloyd, Wright Lee, Le Corbusier, and Mies. They are American, French. Mies was a German. Where formal criticism and analysis of the high modernist transformation of the building into a virtual sculpture or monumental duck, as Robert Venturi puts it, are at one with the reconsiderations on the level of urbanism and of the aesthetic institutions. So it was at that time that the new trend started, and it was started by Robert Venturi, who gave this new term of duck buildings to high modernist architecture. If you have a look, if you search in Google with this title, duck buildings, then you can see very well that actually duck building was in the shape of a duck. And there were other buildings also who had different shapes. Like for example, there was a building having the shape of a basket, like this. So in this way, these were the buildings based on, in fact, sculpture. And the aim of such kind of architecture was to promote the sale of those goods. Those goods could be found in those buildings that had the shape, that had that particular shape. So high modernism is thus credited with the destruction of the fabric of the traditional city and of its older neighborhood culture by way of the radical disjunction. Disjunction word also I took up last time, that it was separation or dislocation of the new utopian high modernist building from its surrounding. So such buildings, they looked altogether different from their surroundings. They looked different or singularly aloof from their surroundings. And yes, utopian high modernist building from its surrounding context, while the prophetic elitism and authoritarianism of the modern movement are remorselessly denounced. So what are those factors that are criticized? Elitism. This is a feature of postmodernism. So we are now moving towards postmodernism in architecture because elite elements will be denounced in favor of the mixing of low culture also. Modern movement are now in the imperial gesture. In the next paragraph, we are moving towards again the same mixing of types of culture, high and low culture. Just have a look at this statement. Postmodernism in architecture will then logically enough stage itself as a kind of aesthetic populism. As the very title of Venturi's influential manifesto, Learning from Las Vegas, suggests. However, we may ultimately wish to evaluate this popular rhetoric. It has at least the merit of drawing our attention to one fundamental feature of all the postmodernists enumerated above. Namely, this is important. You have to focus on this part of the sentence, namely the effacement in them of the older, essentially high modernist frontier between high culture and the so-called mass or commercial culture. So now there is no difference between high culture or elite culture and commercial culture or mass culture. This is the main feature of postmodernism. And it was followed by new trends in literature also. Like, just have a look at it. The emergence of new kinds of texts infused with the forms, categories, and contents of that very culture industry. So passionately denounced by all the ideologues, philosophers or thinkers of the modern, from Lewis, F.R. Lewis, and the American New Criticism, all the way to Adorno and the Frankfurt School. We talked of the Frankfurt School also in our last discussion, that the essence of the Frankfurt School was also the same. Who were the main scholars associated with this? Habermas, Adorno, and Horkheimer. The main points of the Frankfurt School were that the phenomenon of mass culture has a political implication, namely that all forms of popular culture are parts of a single culture industry. Now the purpose, what is the purpose? The purpose is to ensure the continued obedience of the masses to market interest. The masses should remain tied and remain glued to the interests of the market capitalism. That is the main focus of this kind of mixing of high and low culture. The postmodernists have in fact been fascinated precisely by this whole degraded culture of slock and kitsch. This also we have noted down. Slock and kitsch are the elements, popular elements in any culture that cannot be described as very elite in interest or of very high in interest. They are basically poor in quality, low in standard. So that also we have discussed about TV series about Reader Digest culture and advertising motels, grade B Hollywood films, and also para-literature. That literature which we can see in airport, including Gothic and romance, popular biography, murder mystery, etc. So on and so forth. So these books also can be considered as part of literature, but they cannot be quoted. They don't have any content that are worthy of quotation, or we can quote them in our references or citations. In the next paragraph, we are again to the discussion of that term late capitalism that I have told you to keep in mind, because the whole of the discussion in this essay is based on that equation. That equation means the equation of cultural dominant with late capitalism. Whatever we see around us these days, that can be termed as cultural dominant together. All those things can be called as cultural dominant, and they have to be viewed or perceived from the perspective of market economy, that too, the global market economy. So we have to move forward to the next heading, Postmodernism as cultural determinant. A last preliminary word on method. This is his method. He is going to explain what will be his methodology. What follows is not to be read in stylistic description as the account of one cultural style or movement among others. It is not about stylistic description. He says, I have rather meant to offer a periodizing hypothesis. This is a hypothesis. We know that when we begin any study, we have to formulate some hypothesis also. So this is a hypothesis that he has formulated and on which he will function further. The whole of this chapter will be structured on this scaffolding, we can say, or hypothesis, because his hypothesis is that it is in the period of late capitalism that all cultural dominants have to be studied. This is his hypothesis. And that at a moment in which the very conception of the industrial period has come to seem most problematical indeed. I have argued elsewhere that all isolated or discrete cultural analysis always involves a buried or repressed theory of historical periodization. In any case, the concept of genealogy. Genealogy is tracing our descent from some group. It's like discussing our details of our ancestors, that we belong to some group. So conception of the genealogy largely lays to rest traditional theoretical worries about the so-called linear history, theories of stages, and teleological historiography. And teleological means that study in which we have to look into the purpose of things. So there are two ways of looking at things, that we have to trace our lineage from our ancestors, that we have our uh, grandparents and our forefathers and so on and so forth. This is genealogy. This is genealogy. And teleology means if we are going to analyze the reason or the purpose of existence of certain things. So these are two approaches that are used in order to look back to the analysis of things. In the present context, however, lengthier theoretical discussion of such very real issues can perhaps be replaced by a few substantive remarks. Instead of tracing the lineage or instead of going deeper into the purpose or the aim of the things, existence of those things, what we done? Just with the help of some remarks, meaningful remarks, this has to be explained. So what is the first concern? One of the concerns frequently aroused by periodizing hypothesis is, what is the main concern of discussing things in way of making those periods that I have given to you? Like first was the period of market economy, which was intrastate economy. Second was the period when there was imperialism, when countries started moving out in search of further markets. That was uh, also, we were on the verge of globalization. But now, in these days, we are in the most advanced state of globalization. So this is the final stage, and this is period. This is how things have been divided into periods. So what is the main concern of this kind of hypothesis? That these tend to obliterate difference and to project an idea of the historical period as massive homogeneity. So we generally, we shall look at the whole historical uh, happenings, or we can say event, as massive homogeneity, bounded on either side by inexplicable chronological metamorphosis and punctuation marks. Actually, this is never possible. This can never happen, that we can put punctuation marks in case of periods. This never happens because even if there is some metamorphosis, it is not that evident that we can separate one particular age from either the preceding age or the succeeding age. So it is a continuous movement of the features or the characteristics, but on the basis of certain dominant features. Again, I am going to stress on this point that we have to demarcate certain periods in the history of human existence. So this is, however, precisely why, in terms, it seems to me very essential to grasp postmodernism not as a style, but rather as a cultural dominant. So we are now on the main point that we have discussed in PPT also, that he discusses postmodernism as a cultural dominant, a conception which allows for the presence and coexistence of a range of very different yet subordinate features. So why subordinate features? That we can include them within the compass of that particular period. So there are certain definitely distinct features that are, that can be traced within that particular period's boundary. Actually, there is no boundary, but I have used the term boundary just to show, just to tell you that at some point of time we have to mention that this is postmodernism, or before that there was high modernism, and before that there was modernism, and before that there was realism. And in this way, we can move on, keep on moving. Consider, for example, the powerful alternative position that postmodernism is itself little more than one more stage of modernism. Just think, it is quite possible that we can think like this, isn't it? That postmodernism is just an advanced stage of modernism proper, if not indeed of the even older romanticism. So if we keep on looking back and back, further back, then we can trace its similar feature in romanticism also. So in this way, the process can continue. I'm about to enumerate, uh, yes, romanticism. It may indeed be considered that all of the features of postmodernism I'm about to enumerate can be detected full blown in this or that preceding modernism, including such astonishing genealogical precursors as. So, who were the precursors, genealogical precursors of postmodernism? Gertrude Stein, who was an American novelist, Raymond Russell, who was a French poet, Marcel Duchamp, who was again a French painter, who may be considered outright postmodernists, avant la lettre. Avant la lettre means even much before the concept came into existence, before the concept was formed. Which concept? The concept or the idea of postmodernism was formed. Any such term was coined much earlier than that. These three names that Jameson has quoted, they were examples of postmodernist features. So what has not been taken into account by this view is, however, the social position of the older modernism, or better still, its passionate repudiation. Repudiation is criticism by an older Victorian and post-Victorian bourgeois. Bourgeois is the term we keep in mind in the context of Marxism. When bourgeois is there, no doubt there will be proletariat. Proletariat means working class, and naturally bourgeois will be the capitalist, for whom its forms and ethos are received as being variously ugly, dissonant, obscure, scandalous, immoral, subversive, and generally antisocial. So in terms of Victorian morality, whatever followed, if we look from Victorian perspective, so the things that followed, they will be termed like these. These will be the terms that will be used for the features of high modernism. It will be argued here that a mutation in the sphere of culture has rendered such attitudes archaic. Mutation is change in the sphere of culture, because culture keeps on changing. So such kind of allegations that becomes useless, that has become archaic. We keep on moving, no need of looking back. Yes, we can look back, but we cannot adjudge or pass on such statements that it was morally depraved like that. Not only are Picasso and Joyce. Picasso was a well-known painter, and Joyce no longer ugly. They now strike us on the whole as rather realistic. Now, when we are in our present context, when we are viewing these two, James Joyce was the author, writer, and Picasso was the painter. So when we are asked to analyze them, then what will be our reaction? We will not call them ugly or scandalous or immoral. They now strike us on the whole as rather realistic. So things will be now changed when viewed from a changed lens or perspective. And this is a result of canonization. Canonization is forming of rules and canons. Canonization keeps on changing. And an academic institutionalization of the modern movement generally, which can be traced to the late 1950s. This is indeed surely one of the most plausible explanations for the emergence of postmodernism itself. So we can trace the beginning of, in some way, we can trace the beginning of postmodernism to late 1950s. Since the younger generation of the 1960s will now confront the formerly oppositional modern movement as a set of dead classics. That will be, younger generation will consider the modern movement as a set of dead classics which weigh like a nightmare on the brains of the living. This was what actually Marx once said, but that was in a different concept. So when there is a time for change after a certain period, it becomes the inevitable and natural reaction that things start weighing like a nightmare. The previous things, they weigh like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So the living persons have to shrug off that nightmare so that things can move on to a better daylight or better view and perspective. As for the postmodern revolt against all that, however, it must equally be stressed that its own offensive features. What are the offensive features of postmodernism? From obscurity and sexually explicit material to psychological squalor. Just you can mark and note down. These are the main features or themes, you can say, themes of postmodernist literature. And sometimes it might seem offensive also. So from obscurity and sexually explicit material to psychological squalor. Dirt is there. And overt is open. Expressions of social and political defiance. Openly, people are challenging the norms of society, the political norms and social laws, which transcend anything that might have been imagined at the most extreme moments of transcend anything. These are the themes, you can say, which we can see in postmodernist literature. But these are the things that might have been imagined, which transcend anything that might have been imagined in high modernist phase. So this thing cannot have been imagined in high modernist phase of our historical analysis. But this is the change that we have to confront now. No longer scandalous anymore. Previously, they might have been considered as scandalous, as humiliating, but now they are no more scandalous and are not only received with the greatest complacency, but have themselves become institutionalized and are at one with the official culture of the Western society. So now they have been institutionalized That means they have been incorporated. These features that once might have appeared as scandalous for high modernist culture, they have been incorporated, imbibed in the very texture of the culture today in Western society. This is the interpretation of Frederick Jameson. It has become a part of official culture of Western society. Now, the next paragraph, the very first sentence is very important to be noted. What has happened is that aesthetic production today, you see, aesthetic production, the term is very significant because aesthetic production means not the things that are being produced in factory. It means the works of art, painting, and literature. So aesthetic production today has become integrated into commodity production generally. So the two have got inextricably merged. One is art, literature, painting, architecture, etc., and the works of those particular fields. And then the other thing is, the other aspect is their commodification. In fact, they have been commodified. That too, in the interest of capitalism or the market economy. So everything has a market value. Things are viewed from this perspective. The frantic economic urgency of producing fresh waves. This is also important. This is frantic economic urgency that you have to produce, you have to come up with new things. So new waves of ever more novel means new, completely new seeming goods. Things have to be new and better also, better and fashionable also. From the point of view of fashion also, things have to be upgraded, and upgraded means they have to present it keeping in mind the present circumstances, the standards, the present standards. So from clothing, right from clothing to airplanes, when the things are being produced, the main aim, the main motive is to sell more and more as ever greater at ever greater rates of turnover. There has to be greater turnover. Turnover is production. Now assigns an increasingly essential structural function and position to aesthetic innovation and experimentation. So what is the main reason why the artists, they are coming up with experimentation, new ideas, new designs, new methods? Because this is the demand of the time. In order to keep themselves safe in this changing scenario, so yes. Mhm. Yes. Why the artists, they are focusing on experimentation? Because this is the demand of the time. Such economic necessities can find recognition in the institutional support of all kinds available for the newer art, from foundations and grants to museums and other forms of patronage. So in order to promote new things that are coming up, we need, or the artists rather need, some kind of support or patronage. Architecture is, however, of all the arts that closest constitutively to the economic, with which, in the form of commissions and land values, it has a virtually unmediated relationship with what? With the system of support. It will therefore not be surprising to find the extraordinary flowering of the new postmodern architecture grounded in the patronage of multinational business. So I think the idea is now clear. Who is supporting or who is behind the development of new postmodernist architecture? The multinational companies. They are promoting such kind of architectural structures that are coming up fast. The example of Bonaventura Hotel that I have already discussed in the PPT, it is one such example. The multinational companies are promoting this kind of architecture, and this is the support that architecture needs, whose expansion and development is strictly contemporaneous with it. The two things are developing simultaneously. That these two new phenomena have an even deeper dialectical interrelationship than the simple one-to-one functioning of this or that individual project. So we don't have to focus on this or that individual project. We have to focus on such kind of shopping malls that are coming up fast. And we can also quote in this context also the rapid growth of skyscrapers, the high-rise buildings. You know, in Gurgaon is the city that has developed quite recently because of the fast developing economic. It has developed as a special economic zone, and because of many multinational companies, there are number of offices over there. So we shall very soon pick up, we shall stop at one point when there is a description of skyscrapers, flattened skyscrapers, only with shining windows. This is another feature of postmodernist architecture, with no actually aesthetic beauty in that. Tall buildings, flat buildings with no beauty or aesthetic pleasure in them. Only shining windows, they glare at us in the night. Thus, these two new phenomena have an even deeper dialectical interrelationship than the simple one-to-one financing of this or that individual project. We will try to suggest later on. That will be taken up later on. Yet this is the point at which we must remind the reader of the obvious, namely that this whole global, yet American, postmodern culture is the internal and superstructural expression of a whole new wave of American military and economic domination throughout the world. So according to Frederick Jameson, it is a result of what? Of American development. America that emerged in those days in 1980s when this essay was written. America was naturally, it was one of the two superpowers, but at that time it had monopolized every sphere of life all over the world. So the whole new wave of American military, there was military domination as well as economic domination throughout the world. In this sense, as throughout class history, the underside of culture is blood, torture, death, and horror. So this is the essence, the underside, the underlying meaning of class struggle. If capitalist, if a capitalist is there, naturally the other classes, the working class, the labor class, the so-called proletariat, and then naturally the class struggle will involve blood, torture, death, and horror. We can safely skip the next paragraph and come up to the next one. It is from this point that we can begin. More on this point at the conclusion of the present essay. So this point was the distinction, I can tell you, the distinction between modernism and postmodernism that will be discussed later on, according to Jameson. I must now briefly address a different kind of objection to this kind of period analysis, a different kind of concern about its possible obliteration of heterogeneity. So this is the objection. Objection is that heterogeneity is there in any particular period. So when we are putting this kind of title, putting up this kind of argument in favor of terming it as a postmodern period, then we are overlooking heterogeneous elements and are trying to reach at a minimum common cultural dominant. So there has to be a minimum common point that Jameson will term as cultural dominant, overlooking heterogeneous elements, which one finds most often on the left. And it is certain that there is a strange quasi-Sartrean irony. Sartrean word comes from Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a great philosopher and existential philosopher, and whose views can be termed within these two words written within inverted comma, single inverted comma. So Sartrean irony is implied in the winner loses logic. This is a kind of oxymoron. How can a winner lose? Actually, in existentialism, Sartre and before Sartre, Thomas Mann, they have taken up the problems of existence. They have discussed the existence of man or human beings from a different perspective. According to them, it is actually choice and responsibility. It is a matter of choice and responsibility. A man is free to make a choice. There is no such authority or deity, means there is no God according to these philosophers. So man is the maker of his own destiny according to them. Man has to decide, he has to make a decision, and naturally the consequences that follow will have to be borne with. That means he will have to face the consequences also. When he tries to evade the responsibility for the consequences of the choices that he had made, the agony will follow. The agony means we can say great misery will ensue after that. So this is how these philosophers, they have explained or tried to analyze the existence of man. And today's is the in those days, we can say that was the time when men, they were confronted with this kind of agony or deep remorse. So in order to avoid deep remorse and agony, what they have to do, they have to be very faithful to the acceptance of results, or they have to accept the responsibility. So this is what is winner loses logic, which tends to surround any effort to describe a system, a totalizing dynamic, as these are detected in the movement of contemporary society. A totalizing dynamic that can be seen in the contemporary society. What happens is that the more powerful the vision of some increasingly total system. See, if the system is powerful, the more powerful the system is, then what will be the result? Or logic, if the system or logic is powerful, for example, within this parenthesis, we get the Foucault of the prison book is the obvious example. Michel Foucault has also explained in his theory of power, discourse, and knowledge that the then reason, from the point of view of that period, whatever new studies or we can say new sciences they have come up, they have increased kind of some control system or supervision on human beings. They have made human beings crippled, more crippled. So the more powerful the system is, the more powerful the logic is, the less powerful will be the individual. The crippled will be the individual, more crippled will be the individual. The more powerless the reader seems to feel. So the logic, if the logic, the argument that is powerful, in the face of that, the reader will become less powerful. Insofar as the theorist wins, see the theorist who has given you a theory. Therefore, by constructing an increasingly closed and terrifying machine, constructing an increasingly closed and terrifying machine, to that very degree he loses. Since the critical capacity of his work is thereby paralyzed. So the more high sounding, the more complicated the theories are, then the critical ability will be paralyzed. That will be less impressive. Said there will be, that will be paralyzed, and the impulses of negation and revolt, not to speak of those of social transformation, are increasingly perceived as vain and trivial in the face of the model itself. So those question of the very question of negation and revolt, they will be considered as vain and as trivial when the model is so highly imposing. The opposition will fade into insignificance. You know, if you have studied Foucault's theory of power, in that he has explained panopticon also, the system of panopticon. In that panopticon, actually, you can equate it to surveillance. Surveillance is vigilance. there is an authority who is always keeping a vigilance on us without our being aware of that. For that, he has given the example of a panopticon. It was a kind of prison in which the convicts were kept inside their so-called cells. And there was a supervisor, you can say, who could look at them and actually supervise their activities, monitor their activities, but nobody could see him, that supervisor. Similarly, Foucault has also explained this in the context of the plague. In those days, way back, I don't remember the actual year when the plague struck the European country. Then it was expected from the people not to move out. You see, just we also have faced a similar situation very recently in our lockdown period, that when we were supposed to stay inside our homes and to follow the guidelines of the rule or the rules of the authorities, in those days also this kind of system was followed in order to remain safe from infectious diseases like plague. That was the only option left for them, that they had to remain inside the home, locked inside, but under the constant, or we can say strict, vigilance of the authorities. The point is that there is always an authority, there is always power. We are not always aware of that in our day-to-day functioning. We are not aware of that power system, but that functions, and it functions in the way of a very widely spread network. We cannot remain free from this. No, although it is not a part of your this chapter, because since we have a reference to Foucault's prison system here, so I have given you just one brief explanation of his theory, Foucault's theory of power, that can be helpful for you also in your analysis of any work of literature. Just have a look at any work of literature from this point of view, and you will definitely find it really rewarding. Over to the next paragraph. I have felt, however, that it was only in the light of some conception of a dominant cultural logic or hegemonic norm that genuine difference could be measured and assessed. So because of cultural dominant, what can be assessed? Cultural dominant can be assessed. I'm very far from feeling that all cultural production today is postmodern in the broad sense. I will be conferring on this term. The postmodern is, however, the force field in which very different kinds of cultural impulses, what Raymond Williams has usefully termed residual and emergent forms of cultural production. Emergent is fast emerging, coming into prominence, and also residual at the same time. Now you can say, how is it possible? Residual, the remnant, and emergent. So both things go side by side, must make their way if we do not achieve some general sense of a cultural dominant. So we have a number of dominant features, but for that, in order to be very precise, we have to have a cultural dominant. Then if we don't have any such cultural dominant, then we fall back into a view of present history as sheer heterogeneity. Very true. It's very true. Actually, we have to have we have to arrive at some minimum common or similar, you can say, kind of dominant. Otherwise, it's simply a continuous movement of heterogeneous features. History is continuous process, and we cannot come to terms with those heterogeneous process or the features. Then we fall back into a view of present history as sheer heterogeneity, random differences, and a coexistence of a host of distinct forces. Coexistence of a host of distinct forces whose efficiency is undecidable. So when there are a number of things are there existing simultaneously, we cannot adjudge actually in certain terms the effectiveness of those particular things. This has been, at any rate, the political spirit in which the following analysis was devised to project some conception of a new systemic cultural norm and its reproduction in order to reflect more adequately on the most effective form of any radical cultural politics today. So we have to devise some norm in order to discuss a particular period. Now the exposition that follows will take up in turn. This is also we have discussed in PPT, but only in brief. So in the form of these points, we can enumerate these points. He says the exposition, the following discussion will take up in turn the following constitutive features of the postmodern period. First of all, it is a new depthlessness, which finds its prolongation both in contemporary theory. See, for the first time, he has mentioned contemporary theory also. In contemporary theory also, this depthlessness can also be seen. And in a whole new culture of the image or simulacrum, it was a term which also refers to image. That means image of a particular person or a particular thing. It has become the time or period when things are being denoted with the help of image. A consequent second feature is consequent weakening of historicity. That also we noted down because of the lack of any historical connectivity, both in our relationship to public history, in both aspects of our relationship with public history, political history we can say, and in the new forms of our private temporality. Temporality is worldliness. Even in our private life also, we also move in the form of a chronological pattern. So in both these aspects, publicly as well as privately. Now, how this is expressed in schizophrenic structure following Lacan. Lacan was a French psychologist, Jacques Lacan, who propounded the theory of psychoanalysis through language. Through language, how psychological condition can be expressed. This was his viewpoint. In fact, he asserted that unconscious actually existed in the form of words. How it is possible? That we shall see in this very essay, because Jameson has quoted the whole poem, full poem of Bob Perelman, titled as China. We can see the impact of this schizophrenic situation. Very soon we can come to know that it has nothing to do with abnormal situation. Here in this context, it has nothing to do with morbid situation. It is simply the expression of the mental thought process, how in the words, in the pattern that we shall see very soon. So a consequent, yes, it's schizophrenic structure following Lacan will determine new types of syntax. See, we have come to this point. It will determine new types of syntax or syntagmatic relationship. This is the linguistic structure in the more temporal arts. Of whole temporal arts means that we can see actually is physical, in physical form. So our unconscious depicted through language in physical expression or in various forms of physical art. A whole new type of emotional ground tone. This also we have pointed out in our PPT, that there is a change in the emotional ground tone, what I will call intensities. This is intensities that that is the new term, actually not the new term, the term that is given by Jameson to the emotional expression that ensues after this kind of feeling, which can best be grasped by a return to the older theories of the sublime. But in order to understand it, the older theories need to be consulted. The deep constitutive relationships of all this to a whole new technology. No, all these three things that I have told you to mark, these three things or three features, they have to be looked at from the point of view of a whole new technology, which is itself a figure for a whole new economic world system. And after a brief account of postmodernist mutations in the lived experience of built space itself, some reflections on the mission of political art in the bewildering new world space of late multinational capital. So the new technological developments, they have to be viewed from the multinational, in the multinational era, from the perspective of multinational, corporate, globalized culture of late capitalism. Um, am I not exceeding the time? What is the time? I want to just check. How much time do I have now? Am I audible?
Ma'am, I think meeting will end on 2:20.
It will go on up to 2:20.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we have two examples. A very beautiful exemplification of high modernist and postmodernist art. Peasant shoes and the diamond dust shoes. That I also told you to just focus on in PPT. Peasant shoes, actually in brief, I will tell you, after that I will start reading the text. Peasant shoes was the title of the painting made by Van Gogh. Van Gogh was a Dutch painter, and he lived a very tough life. He lived a life of hardships, poverty. So he focused on, this was his means aim, to draw a pair of shoes. Those shoes that are worn by peasants. And we know that the peasants live a very difficult life of hard work and toil. And actually, what happened when he made that painting, from some friend's reference, there is a reference that he purchased a pair of shoes from a flea market. You know what is flea market? In the flea market, second-hand things are sold. Second-hand items are sold in the flea market. So he purchased a pair of second-hand shoes, and that too he wore for a number of time so that it could be covered with mud. It could become rough. Only after that he used that pair of shoes as model for his painting peasant shoes. So it has become a classic of high modernist painting. You can search it in Google and you can have a look at. Right now also I have that pic, but I cannot share it with you at the same time. You can have a look at the picture of peasant shoes, and then I would give you a task of analyzing it, although you are not used to analyzing pictures like this. But the point is that because we are focused on the interpretation, the hermeneutic capability of high modernist art and literature. So the point is that, are we capable of interpreting this painting? That is up to you. Just have a look at this painting. You can search it in Google and try to analyze it. Now, the time is for the discussion of this part of the text, peasant shoes. We will begin with one of the canonical works of high modernism. In visual art, Van Gogh's well-known painting of the peasant shoes, an example which, as you can imagine, has not been innocently or randomly chosen. It is not without purpose that he has referred to this kind of example. He says, I want to propose two ways of reading this painting. He is himself proposing two ways. Yes, Depriya, do you want to say something? I thought that perhaps someone wanted to say something. So I want to propose two ways of reading this painting, both of which in some fashion reconstruct the reception of the work in two-stage and double-level process. So what are those two ways in which Jameson has analyzed this painting? I first want to suggest that if this copiously reproduced image, abundantly, copiously means a number of times, reproduced image is not to sink to the level of sheer decoration. It should not just be a piece of decoration in anybody's drawing room. It requires us to reconstruct some initial situation out of which the finished work emerges. So first of all, we have to look back at the situation from where this kind of painting has come up. Unless that situation, which has vanished into the past, is somehow mentally restored, the painting will remain an inert object. Inert means lifeless object. Naturally, if we don't know about the background, just as I explained to you in the beginning, that it was how Van Gogh made this kind of painting just to focus on the hardships of the peasants. Then if we don't know about the background, then it will remain just an inert object, just a lifeless object without any meaning or symbolic significance, just a reified end product. Reified means a concretized thing. That means a symbol that is given a concrete physical shape, end product. So we can say it was just a physical end product. It would remain if we don't know the background, and be unable to be grasped as a symbolic act in its own right. We cannot understand the symbolic meaning of this painting as praxis and as production. Praxis is practice. So things will remain just as abstract and theoretical in practice, and in production, it will not come into recognition. This last term means production, suggests that one way of reconstructing the initial situation in which the work is somehow a response is by stressing the raw materials. So we have to focus on the raw materials, the initial context which it confronts and which it reworks, transforms, and appropriates. In one go, that concrete, those initial raw materials are, I will suggest, to be grasped simply as the whole object world of agricultural misery. So this is important. If you are going to write a review on this kind of painting, suppose you are asked to write a review, not of a book, but of this painting, how will you write? So Jameson's viewpoint is that, first of all, it is about agricultural misery, or of stark rural poverty, and the whole rudimentary human world. Rudimentary is basic. Human world of back-breaking peasant toil, very natural, back-breaking. The peasant has to work so hard that his back starts paining. A world reduced to its most brutal and menaced, threatened, primitive, and marginalized status. So this is a world of the peasant. Just a pair of shoes is there. Have a look at this beautiful painting. Only a pair of shoes is there. But when you are up to this kind of interpretation, you can find that it narrates the tale of the peasant's hard life. Fruit trees in this world, referring to that painting, fruit trees in this world are ancient and exhausted sticks coming out of the poor soil. The people of the village are worn down to their skulls. They are no more there, just have been degraded to this skull only. Caricatures of some ultimate grotesque typology of basic human feature types. How is it then that in one go, such things as apple trees explode into a hallucinatory surface? In paintings of one go, if apple trees are there, how do they create a kind of hallucination? While his village stereotypes are suddenly and garishly overlaid. Village stereotypes, or the figures typically represent